Hello and welcome to this review of my new F104 keyboards. Not to be confused with the similarly named F104 Unsaver, which was a vintage IBM made model, this is instead a brand new keyboard produced by Joe, aka Ellipse, who also did the repro Model F keyswitches, which you can still buy by the way. There is also a Battleship model available this round, which warms the cockles of my heart. You know, whatever those anatomically may be. Joe sent me these for review, which I've been highly anticipating. I should mention that he sent me only one at first, but that one appears to have developed some sort of fault during transport, to which I'll come back later. So he sent me a second one, which is this handsome beast. But first, some background. The IBM Model F is the predecessor to the Model M keyboard, which is arguably the most famous and certainly one of the most beloved keyboards in history. It is the originator of the current modern keyboard layout, which means that short of the Remington No. 2's QWERTY layout, it can count itself among the most influential keyboards ever made. With the addition of Windows and menu keys, it's what the majority of standard Office keyboards still use almost 4 decades after its introduction. The quality of its buckling spring key switches is almost no less famous. They are legendary for their satisfying tactile feel and auditory feedback, which, by the way, are perfectly synchronized with the switch's actuation, as the clicker is also the actuator. Only a very small number of key switches, which doesn't include Cherry MX or virtually any other modern switches, by the way, have inherently synchronized clicks and actuations. Some other examples include beam springs, Alps plate spring, Mark Ward butterfly, and Razor LK optoelectric clicky switches. What not everyone knows, though, is that the Model M was a cost-saving measure, and as a result, the older, more high-tech Model F is known for having switches that are even smoother and crisper to use, with an even louder clicky sound as it happens, and it is almost universally agreed to feel better even than the Model M, which is a high bar. Its switches are based on capacitance rather than on a membrane, so they additionally have greatly increased lifetime and reliability at an estimated 100 million actuations, as well as inherent N-key rollover, which the Model M didn't have. I think it's no exaggeration to say that the Model F is one of the best keyboards ever made, and capacitive buckling springs are in my top 3 best clicky switches of all time. Not a bad spot considering the many hundreds of switches I own. The only problem is obviously that, with the Model M being the first keyboard with a modern layout, the Model F, being its predecessor, had non-standard layouts, although most of them immediately became keyboard standards themselves when they were released. The F was produced in a variety of form factors and layouts, from keypads to battleships, but there never was anything that would be particularly familiar to a general modern audience. The keyswacher was similar to a 60% layout, except slightly weirder. The AT version could be MacGyvered into something that vaguely resembled a Win-keyless ANSI TKL, except with 10 F keys in at the left rather than at the top, as well as a more cluttered nav cluster. And the Battleship was somewhat similar to an ISO model with a lot of extra keys and a more annoying cross-shaped set of arrow keys, rather than the more familiar and useful inverse T one, but nothing really came all that close to something as versatile as a standard full-size layout. I think the closest they ever came to a normal layout was the full-size 4704 keyboard, which Joe curiously did not reproduce during his first round, but even this is kinda weird in a few ways, and though it is very workable and a very nice keyboard, it is rare and very expensive. And because form factor, and especially layout, is extremely important to a lot of people, to the point where this appears to be the primary selection criterion for the majority of my viewers, the Model M remained the favorite choice for many, as it was easier to work with, despite having a slightly less nice key feel. But now we have the best of both worlds, Model F guts in a Model M layout. And it is glorious. So let's get the easy stuff out of the way first. It feels amazing. The switches are on par with the originals, which is a big compliment, and they have the same sing-songy pingy sound that's unmistakable in a Model F. It types like a dream, and unless you're playing something where hysteresis is a big no-go, you can game on it very nicely too. I've tested it myself. I assume the OSU crowd will want something that you can spam click more easily than this, but overall I was extremely satisfied with my time testing out this keyboard. It's smooth with that subtle but crisp, sharp tactility, just mwah. In terms of build quality, it's no slouch either. In fact, in some ways, it's built better than an original IBM. The case, whose iconic wedge shape and look was lifted right off the Model M, is not made out of PVC like the original, but die-cast aluminium on top instead, and the back panel is steel. The 4704 repros he did previously were made out of cast zinc, which is much denser than aluminium, but the added bulk of this full-size model means that the two kind of even out, and this weighs at just over 3.5 kilos, or in imperial attempts at measuring units, just under 8 pounds. That's insane! That's almost the weight of an original battleship, or 2 Model M keyboards. A lot of the weight also comes from the assembly, which is even more ridiculous. It consists of a steel mounting plate for the spring wells and a steel back plate as well, with a rainbow effect just like the originals. Honestly, for all intents and purposes, this keyboard is more or less literally bulletproof. It bears mentioning that the cable is fixed in place. The original Model M had a detachable, coiled SDL cable that spoke PS2. This one is a more modern, straight braided USB cable. It's high quality, not too stiff, and although it's not coiled like the originals, it is impressively long at around 3 meters, which is 10 tootsies for the Americally afflicted among you guys. Note that you can actually detach the cable if it's really necessary. It's just a standard USB-C cable. You just need to plug it out of the controller here and unscrew this little thing here, but that does mean you need to open the case every time you want to attach or detach it. The bottom case is a little bit different from a Model M as well. It doesn't have the M's famously non-grippy plastic riser feet, but instead it comes with the cork pads of a Model F. These of course don't allow for steeper angling, but they are much better at keeping the keyboard in place. At the back is also a sticker that shows the manufacture date, serial number and model type. It comes in various color schemes. Apart from the ones I'm showing here, you can also get it in black, silver, red and dark and light blue, and in various formats such as ANSI, ISO and expanded HHKB, as well as a slew of languages. I think this is a very shrewd move because I very frequently see comments in my videos that the lack of a certain language or layout is a deal breaker for people, so by having all this choice, I'm sure he can get a lot more buyers. I myself opted for a classic beige one in ISO UK layout and an industrial grey one with the optional 12-key blue Mopar key set, which was inspired by an original IBM industrial space-saving keyboard attached to a Mopar diagnostic system PC, which had these blue keys with wacky legends on it as a specialty. Though these are of course repros, the originals are extremely desirable. The keycaps themselves are massively thick PBT with dye-sublimed legends, and they are razor sharp. I happen to know that Joe, who's quite a perfectionist, went through a lot of extra effort to find a supplier that could produce these keycaps with XT era quality sharpness, and it really shows. These keycaps are really nice, and they come with a very satisfying texture to them as well. As with almost everything IBM made, they are top-tier quality. For the record, they are the Model F single-piece caps, not the ones with exchangeable tops like on a Model M. There's also a whole bunch of extras you can get, as you can see, including spare parts, specialty keycaps, including releginables, and some other stuff. It's worth going through all the options here. Get the solenoid if you're feeling especially hardcore. It basically makes the keyboard, which is already possibly the noisiest keyboard in existence, way louder. I think it's one of Joe's newer, extra powerful ones too. When using it for an extended period of time, I genuinely feel like I need hearing protection. Another improvement is the programmability. Joe's previous keyboards, the Keysaver repros, were originally set up for QMK only and had a very hands-off approach about help with regards to getting this set up for programmability suites that normal human beings can actually understand, as QMK is clearly intended for multi-dimensional beings with an IQ in the billions instead. I made a big rant about that in my previous video, and thankfully he's taken that to heart, as he's made a detailed video on how to set it up, but much more importantly, he made it so that this keyboard comes pre-configured to be compatible with Vial, which is a much more user-friendly alternative. I've been told Vial can be a total bitch to get set up, but because the board comes set up for it out of the factory, it's just pure smooth sailing. A nice bonus, you don't have to save any changes to the keyboard or flash firmware or whatever. Any changes you make take effect immediately, which is nice. I like that a lot. So basically, the keyboard is just excellent in virtually every way imaginable. Joe really did very, very well here again. It's easily one of the best keyboards I've ever used. But, as is so often the case with the best keyboards, it comes with a catch. In this case, a manual. And I mean that very literally. For example, while my keyboard came fully set up, as it's a review unit, by default you don't get it with the keys installed. You have to do that yourself. And you have to do that in a somewhat specific way, because on a Model F, the keycap is also the slider, and therefore a functional part of the switches. The most important thing to note here is that you should do the assembly with the board like this, standing upright, and the springs should be touching the middle bottom of the barrels before putting on the caps, or they might not fix to the pre-angler properly and fail to function. Now, that is frankly a piece of piss. It's super easy. However, that's not the only thing you'll probably have to do to set the keyboard up for usage. See, while the Model F is famously reliable and rugged, it is not immune to the mayhem and utter violence that is modern shipping. Packages are routinely tossed out of airplanes onto loading vehicles after all, and this results in these keyboards getting shaken up so badly that it's pretty common, to the point of being normal, that some of the springs partially dislodge from the flipper nubs, which causes an asymmetry that often interferes with proper buckling, leading to switches that actuate unreliably or transpose with other keys. After all, the Model F is not a blunt instrument or something simple like an office keyboard. It is a highly sophisticated piece of engineering made by one of the most technologically advanced companies in history. Buckling springs have such tight manufacturing tolerances that Joe reported the original producer he had at some point simply gave up trying to meet IBM's 1980s part tolerances standards, and he had to go find a new one because they just couldn't find the parts precisely enough, which I find fucking hilarious. Alps Electric at some point even filed a patent for a new modified buckling spring switch design, which includes a special buckle assister, presumably because they couldn't be asked to go through all this palaver. Now, in order to fix any of these partially dislodged springs, you need to push the springs back onto the spring nubs on the flippers using, for example, tweezers or chopsticks. In case they are bent or get bent during this process, you need to replace them, which is why I strongly advise getting some extra springs and flippers in the form of the optional first aid kit, as the board doesn't include spares by default. It's $49 extra, which I find a puzzlingly high amount for just a few spare parts, but you'll be glad to have them when you need them. Anyway, in order to get the keyboard ready for use in this manner, Joe has prepared a rather lengthy manual, as well as an hour-long instructional video, and he fully expects that, and I quote, "Everyone should be reading the manual cover to cover and watching the hour-long setup video. I know it is tempting to hunt around the manual and look for just the specific fix to the immediate issue one is having, but I do not recommend it." On a side note, I've never been more self-aware of my own ADD as when I read him unironically stating this. This sort of setup work is routine, and issues that arise from partially loose springs are not grounds for return, which is why he claims limited warranty for these keyboards. So if you dislike the prospect of probably having to do out-of-the-box maintenance and some setup work, as well as a fair bit of reading and watching before you can, or at least should, use the keyboard, this might frankly not be the board for you. Now, it's not all bad. Joe has assured me that, and I quote again, people will not be left with non-working boards. So if there is something genuinely broken, he will replace or repair it. For example, the first one I got in appears to have some sort of controller problem where keys randomly stop and start working, and no matter how much I tried adjusting the springs, nothing seemed to work. Now, this sort of fault is clearly an overt malfunction and not part of the routine setup procedure, and therefore it's covered by his warranty. It's also not supposed to be a particularly difficult process. This second replacement keyboard I got in, for example, came with two keys, the G and J, that transposed, i.e. when you were typing rapidly, these would often come in after another keystroke they were supposed to precede. So, for example, Joe became Oj. This was, again, a spring misalignment issue, and with some tweezers I had this fixed with a bit of trial and error in about 5 minutes. So if you read the manual and watch the video, it shouldn't be that big of a hassle to get it set up. Admittedly, prodding around in the cramped confines of these barrels can be a bit fiddly, especially as it can be difficult to see inside them at the same time, and if I'm honest, 5 minutes was probably faster than most. But the beauty of a Model F is that if all else fails, you can still just take the assembly apart and fix it like that. That's a bit more work, obviously, and you'll need some C-clamps to put it back together again, but it does add a lot to the serviceability of the keyboard. Now, in my experience with Model F keyboards, at least the vintage ones, if you have them set up properly, there's very little that's going to be able to fuck it up again, unless maybe you throw it out of another freight aircraft or something. In fact, this keyboard is likely to survive you or a nuclear apocalypse. Just not UPS. They really are very durable, and if something happens, it's almost always hand fixable, which is why the by now 40-year-old originals are still going strong as well. They can genuinely last you a lifetime with some simple care and maintenance. But again, it comes with a manual, and that is something you shouldn't overlook. Overall, minor setting up issues aside, this keyboard is quite simply outstanding. It's not an exaggeration to say that this is one of the best keyboards I've ever used, and with well over 500 models under my belt, that's high praise. If you aren't fazed by the setup and prep time required before using this keyboard, I can highly recommend it. It's an absolute pleasure to use, and perhaps the length of this script is a good testimony to that. It costs $400 without any add-ons, which is a lot for a keyboard, but considering what you're getting for it and how difficult it is to engineer and manufacture these apparently, I think it's not at all unreasonable. Some people might scoff at the idea of a $400 keyboard that you might have to do out-of-the-box maintenance and setup work for, of course, and I sympathize with that sentiment. In fact, I got pretty miffed trying in vain to fix that first one I got in. But if he had included a full warranty for these minor issues, the price point would have been way higher, to the point of being prohibitively expensive, so I get why he did it like that. I think that's a completely fair compromise. Of course, for this sort of price point, you can get an original Model F as well. A Model F XT, for example, which is the most common and cheap one, can be had for as little as $200 or $300. But you may be getting a crappy one instead of a factory fresh unit, and most importantly, like I mentioned at the beginning, this keyboard offers you something no IBM made Model F ever could give you. So, as much as I love vintage stuff, especially vintage IBM stuff, I think this keyboard is seriously worth considering. That's it for this review. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. And following are 2 typing demonstrations, one with the solenoid off and one with it on.